The whispers followed Faith O'Malley like a thundercloud as she walked down the dusty main street of Promise Creek. It was 1873, and the small frontier town nestled in the foothills of the Wyoming Territory had never seen a woman quite like her. The dress she wore wasn't scandalous by Eastern standards, dark blue cotton that fell just above her ankles, but her unescorted presence, and the leather-bound journal clutched to her chest, marked her as something different, something that didn't belong. "Shameful," came Reverend Hathaway's voice, loud enough to carry across the street as Faith passed the white-steepled church. A woman alone, without family or husband, peddling stories and ideas. It's unnatural. Faith kept her eyes forward, her auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her shoulders straight despite the weight of the town's judgment. 6 months ago, she'd arrived with dreams of starting a newspaper. 6 months of struggle, of sleeping in the back room of her rented office, of eating beans from a can when her meager savings ran too thin. 6 months of proving that a 24-year-old woman could make her own way. The bell above Anderson's general store jingled as Faith pushed open the door. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee, leather, and tobacco filled her nostrils. Mrs. Anderson, a kindly woman with silver-streaked hair, offered a hesitant smile from behind the counter. "Morning, Miss O'Malley. What can I get for you today?" "Just some ink and paper, please," Faith replied, placing a few coins on the counter. "And perhaps any news from the stagecoach driver. I'm hoping my printing press parts will arrive soon." Mrs. Anderson's expression turned apologetic. "I'm afraid Reverend Hathaway was in earlier. He mentioned that the church committee has concerns about your newspaper." Faith's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. "I see. Well, the freedom of the press is protected by the Constitution, Mrs. Anderson, even in Promise Creek." The door swung open behind her, bringing with it the smell of horses and open country. Faith turned to see a tall man she'd never encountered before. Dust covered his denim pants and the worn leather vest over his faded blue shirt. A Stetson hat cast shadows across sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, caught hers for a moment before he nodded politely and stepped toward the counter. "Samuel Garrett," he introduced himself to Mrs. Anderson. "Just rode in, looking to stock up before heading to the Barlow Ranch." "Oh, you must be the new foreman Mr. Barlow hired," Mrs. Anderson replied, brightening. "He mentioned you'd be arriving from Colorado." The stranger Samuel nodded again, his gaze sliding back to Faith. There was something in that look that made her spine straighten, a curiosity without judgment. "And this is Miss Faith O'Malley," Mrs. Anderson continued. She's starting a newspaper." "Is that so?" Samuel's voice was deep, with the slight rasp of a man who didn't waste words. Always good to have someone telling the truth around these parts. Before Faith could respond, the door opened again, and Reverend Hathaway's imposing figure filled the entrance. The preacher was a tall man with a thick salt and pepper beard and cold eyes that had never shown Faith anything but disapproval. His black coat and collar seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the store's windows. "Mrs. Anderson," he greeted, then his gaze fell on Faith. "Miss O'Malley, I trust you've reconsidered your enterprise." "I have not, Reverend," Faith replied evenly. "The first edition of the Promise Creek Herald will be published as soon as my equipment arrives." The preacher's face darkened. "A woman has no business running a newspaper. It's inappropriate and unseemly. You're becoming a shame to this town with your stubborn refusal to accept your proper place." Faith felt her cheeks burn, but before she could defend herself, Samuel Garrett stepped forward, placing himself slightly between her and the preacher. "Seems to me," he said quietly, that a town newspaper would be a blessing, not a shame. Information's as valuable as water out here. Reverend Hathaway's eyes narrowed. Mr. Garrett, is it? You're new here. You don't understand our ways. Understand enough, Samuel replied, his relaxed posture belying the steel in his voice. Where I come from, folks judge people by their character, not whether they wear trousers or skirts. The preacher's mouth tightened into a thin line. This woman has no husband, no family, no proper guardian. She sleeps in her office and consorts with all manner of people for her so-called stories. What would you call that? Samuel looked at Faith, really looked at her, then back to the preacher. I'd call her determined. And from what I can see, she's the only blessing this town needs, someone brave enough to stand up for what's right. The silence that followed was broken only by Mrs. Anderson's shocked intake of breath. Faith felt something unfurl in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with finding an unexpected ally. Reverend Hathaway's face flushed with anger. You'll regret taking her side, Mr. Garrett. Good day, Mrs. Anderson. He turned and strode out, the door slamming behind him. Samuel turned to Faith, his expression unreadable. Seems you've made quite an impression, Miss O'Malley. Not a favorable one, apparently, Faith replied, finding her voice. Thank you for your support, Mr. Garrett, though I fear you've just made an enemy on your first day in town. A small smile quirked the corner of his mouth. Wouldn't be the first time. He tipped his hat to her. Looking forward to reading your newspaper, Miss O'Malley. As he turned back to his business with Mrs. Anderson, Faith clutched her journal tighter. For the first time since arriving in Promise Creek, she felt something other than determination keeping her going, a flicker of hope that perhaps not everyone in this town saw her as the shame Reverend Hathaway claimed she was. Faith left the general store with her supplies, the encounter with Samuel Garrett replaying in her mind as she walked back to her small office at the edge of town. The building was little more than a weathered wooden structure with a faded sign hanging above the door that read Promise Creek Herald in her own careful lettering. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. The main room contained a desk, a few chairs, and shelves filled with the books she'd brought from Boston. A curtained doorway led to the back room where she slept on a narrow cot. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first thing she'd ever truly owned. Faith placed her newly purchased supplies on the desk and sank into her chair, opening her journal. She'd been documenting the lives and stories of Promise Creek since her arrival, the ranchers struggling with drought, the Chinese laborers building the railroad 20 miles north, the Arapaho families displaced by settlers. Stories that needed telling, even if Reverend Hathaway and his supporters found them uncomfortable. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Faith closed her journal and smoothed her skirts before answering. Samuel Garrett stood on her threshold, hat in hand, the dying sunlight casting long shadows across the street behind him. Mr. Garrett, Faith said, surprise evident in her voice. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Miss O'Malley. He nodded, a certain awkwardness in his posture that hadn't been present in the store. I wanted to apologize if I overstepped earlier, not my place to fight your battles. Faith's eyebrows rose. On the contrary, Mr. Garrett, I appreciated the support. Please come in. She stepped aside and Samuel entered, his tall frame making the office seem suddenly smaller. He looked around with interest, taking in the books and the makeshift desk. You've done a lot with a little, he observed. Necessity is quite the motivator, Faith replied, gesturing for him to take a seat while she perched on the edge of her desk. What brings you here, Mr. Garrett, besides offering apologies that aren't needed? Samuel settled into the chair, his hat resting on his knee. Curiosity, I suppose. Not every day you meet a woman starting her own newspaper in a town like this. Faith smiled slightly. And not every day I meet a cowboy willing to stand up to Reverend Hathaway for a stranger. Former soldier, actually. Cavalry, he shrugged. Spent the last 5 years working ranches from Texas to Colorado, and I've never much cared for men who use religion to bully others. Faith studied him, noting the way he held himself straight-backed but relaxed, the kind of alertness that came from years of watching horizons. His hands were calloused, with a small scar across the back of his right one, and despite the trail dust, there was an inherent neatness to him. "What brought you to Promise Creek?" she asked. "Job offer. Barlow's expanding his herd, needed someone who knows cattle and men." Samuel paused. "And you? There must be easier places for a woman to start a newspaper." Faith laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "Probably. But the Wyoming Territory has given women more rights than most places, and the stories here, the railroad, the ranchers, the native tribes, they need telling. I worked for a newspaper in Boston, but only as a secretary. No one would publish my writing. Because you're a woman. Because I wanted to write about more than society, parties, and fashion." Faith's hand drifted to her journal. "I saved every penny for 2 years to buy a printing press and come west." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Takes courage to leave everything familiar behind," says the man who's worked ranches from Texas to Colorado, Faith countered with a small smile. "Different kind of courage," he replied quietly. "I was running from memories. You're running towards something." The honesty in his words created a moment of connection between them, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different paths. Faith found herself wanting to know more about the memories he was running from, but the shadows lengthening across her floor reminded her of the late hour. Samuel seemed to notice as well, rising to his feet. "I should get back to the ranch. Mr. Barlow expects me to start work tomorrow at dawn." "Of course," Faith said, standing as well. "Thank you again for your support today, Mr. Garrett." "Sam," he corrected her. "My friends call me Sam." "Then you must call me Faith," she replied, extending her hand. He took it, his large hand gentle around her smaller one. "Faith," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Fitting name for someone who believes in something better. After he left, Faith stood in the doorway watching his tall figure disappear down the darkening street. For the first time in months, she felt less alone in Promise Creek. The following week brought unexpected challenges for Faith. 3 of her advertising clients withdrew their support after visits from Reverend Hathaway, and the bank informed her that her loan application for additional equipment had been denied. Most troubling was the anonymous note slipped under her door. "Women who don't know their place get taught lessons." Faith reported the note to Sheriff Mills, but his response was less than encouraging. "Can't do much about words on paper, Miss O'Malley," he said, turning the note over in his weathered hands. "No law against folks expressing opinions, even ugly ones. And if those opinions turn to actions," Faith pressed, the sheriff sighed, handing the note back, "then you come see me. Until then, might be wise to reconsider what you're doing here. Some folks don't take kindly to change." Faith left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated but more determined than ever. She spent the afternoon interviewing Mrs. Chen, whose husband worked on the railroad, documenting the dangerous conditions and meager pay the Chinese laborers endured. It was exactly the kind of story the territorial newspapers ignored, and exactly why Faith had come west. As she walked back to her office, the sight of a familiar horse tied outside stopped her in her tracks. Sam Garrett was leaning against her building, arms crossed over his chest, seemingly lost in thought until he spotted her. "Faith," he said, straightening. Was beginning to think you'd left town. Not a chance, she replied, climbing the steps to her door, though it seems some people wish I would. She showed him the note as they entered her office. Sam's expression darkened as he read it. Sheriff Mills wasn't concerned, Faith added, taking her seat behind the desk. Mills is more interested in keeping the peace than upholding the law, Sam said, handing the note back. Have there been other threats? Faith shook her head. Just the usual disapproval. Several advertisers have withdrawn their support, though. Hathaway's work, most likely. Faith sighed, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. But my press parts finally arrived yesterday. The first edition goes out next week with or without advertisers. Sam's eyes crinkled at the corners. Stubborn, aren't you? I prefer determined, Faith replied with a small smile, echoing his words from their first meeting. He laughed, a warm sound that filled the small office. Fair enough. He hesitated, then reached into his vest pocket. Actually, I brought something for you. He placed a small object on her desk, a brass key that gleamed in the afternoon light. What's this? Faith asked, picking it up. Key to the old storage room behind the Barlow Ranch office, Sam explained. Mr. Barlow said you can use it if you need somewhere safer to stay. It's small, but it has a proper door with a lock and a window. No charge. Faith stared at the key, emotions warring within her. Pride told her to refuse. She'd managed on her own this far. But practical sense reminded her that her current sleeping arrangements were far from secure. That's very kind, she said finally. But I can't impose. It's not imposing if it's offered freely, Sam interrupted gently. And it would put my mind at ease, knowing you have somewhere secure to sleep. Faith looked up at him, trying to read his expression. You're concerned for me, Sam met her gaze steadily. I am. Two simple words, but the way he said them made something flutter in Faith's chest. She closed her fingers around the key. Thank you, I'll consider it. Sam nodded, seemingly satisfied. Barlow's place is 3 miles east. Follow the creek road. He paused. I've got to get back. We're moving cattle to the north pasture today, but I'll check in on you soon. After he left, Faith sat holding the key, turning it over in her fingers. Part of her wanted to maintain her independence at all costs, to prove she could succeed without anyone's help. But another part, a part she'd nearly forgotten during her months of isolation in Promise Creek, craved connection and safety. She slipped the key into her pocket, decision made. Tonight, she would sleep somewhere secure. The Barlow Ranch was one of the largest in the territory, with a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings spread across a valley rich with grass and water. Faith arrived just as the sun was setting, her few belongings packed in a single trunk loaded on a borrowed wagon. A ranch hand directed her to the small room behind the main office, a simple space with whitewashed walls, a narrow bed, and a small table. It was hardly luxurious, but compared to her back room at the newspaper office, it felt like a palace. The door had a solid lock, and the window overlooked a corral where horses dozed in the fading light. After settling in, Faith ventured outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The ranch was peaceful at this hour, with most hands finished for the day and gathered at the bunkhouse. In the distance, she could see riders returning from the north pasture, one of them unmistakably Sam, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. She watched as he dismounted and handed his horse off to a stable boy, then spoke briefly with an older man she assumed was Mr. Barlow. When Sam looked up and spotted her standing near the office, he said something to his employer and then headed in her direction. "You came," he said as he approached, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Your argument was persuasive," Faith replied. "And I have to admit, It's nice to have a proper door that locks. Sam smiled, removing his hat and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. You get settled in all right? Yes, thank you. Faith gestured toward the main house. Mr. Barlow seems amenable to having me here. I was worried he might not approve. Barlow's fair-minded. His wife was a schoolteacher before they married, believes in education and progress. Sam glanced toward the bunkhouse, where laughter and the sounds of a harmonica drifted through the evening air. Hungry. Cook always makes plenty. Faith hesitated. She'd grown accustomed to eating alone, to avoiding the stares and whispers that followed her in town. The men won't bother you, Sam added, reading her hesitation. Barlow doesn't tolerate disrespect, and neither do I. In that case, Faith said, straightening her shoulders, I'd be delighted to join you for dinner. The bunkhouse dining area fell silent when Faith entered with Sam, 24 weather-beaten faces turning to stare at the unexpected female presence. Then Mr. Barlow stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples and kind eyes. Miss O'Malley, he greeted her warmly. Welcome to our table. My wife would be here to welcome you properly, but she's visiting our daughter in Cheyenne. Please sit. The atmosphere relaxed as Faith took a seat beside Sam, and conversation gradually resumed around them. The food was simple but abundant: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Faith found herself engaging in conversation with the men about conditions in town, the progress of the railroad, and the upcoming cattle drive to Cheyenne. So you're really starting a newspaper all on your own? Asked a young ranch hand named Tommy, eyes wide with admiration. I am, Faith confirmed. The first edition will be ready next week. What sorts of things will you write about? Another hand asked. Everything that matters, Faith replied. The railroad, ranching conditions, town developments. I want to tell the stories that aren't being told. Like them Chinese workers getting paid half what white men get for the same work? Asked an older hand. Faith nodded. Exactly like that. No wonder Hathaway's got his collar in a twist, Tommy said with a grin. He owns shares in that railroad company. Faith's eyes widened. He does. That wasn't in any of the company records I could access. It's through his brother-in-law's name, Mr. Barlow confirmed, joining the conversation. Not common knowledge, but those of us who have been here a while know it. Faith's mind raced with the implications. Reverend Hathaway's opposition to her newspaper suddenly made more sense. He feared exposure of his business interests that might not align with his public persona of piety and moral authority. As dinner concluded, Faith found herself surrounded by men offering information and perspectives she'd never have gained otherwise. By the time she and Sam walked back to her small room, her journal was filled with notes for future articles. Thank you, she said as they reached her door. That was enlightening. Told you Barlow runs a good outfit, Sam replied. These men see what's happening around here, who's honest and who isn't. They just don't usually have anyone asking them about it. Faith looked up at him, moonlight silvering his features. And you, Sam Garrett. What do you see? He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. I see a woman brave enough to stand alone for what she believes in, and I see a town that needs her, whether they know it yet or not. The sincerity in his voice made Faith's breath catch. For a moment she thought he might step closer, might reach for her hand. Instead, he tipped his hat. Good night, Faith. Sleep well. Good night, Sam, she replied softly, watching as he walked away toward the bunkhouse, his tall figure gradually swallowed by shadows. Inside her room, Faith lit the lamp and opened her journal again, reviewing her notes from dinner. But her mind kept drifting to Sam, the way he defended her, the respect in his eyes when she spoke of her work, the subtle warmth in his voice when he said her name. She'd come west to pursue her dream of journalism, not to find a man. Yet something about Samuel Garrett made her wonder if perhaps both pursuits might be possible. The next morning, Faith rose early and hitched a ride back to town with one of Barlow's supply wagons. Her press parts had arrived, and she spent the day assembling the small machine with the help of instructions from the manufacturer and her own stubborn determination. By evening, ink-stained and exhausted but triumphant, she had printed a test page, the Promise Creek Herald, in bold letters across the top. Over the next 3 days, Faith worked tirelessly, writing articles, setting type, and printing pages. She slept at the Barlow Ranch each night, grateful for the security it provided, and returned to town each morning. Sam checked on her whenever their paths crossed, bringing her coffee or offering to help move heavy equipment, but he never intruded on her work. On the 4th day, Faith finished the first edition of her newspaper. 8 pages of local news, including a front-page exposé on working conditions at the railroad camp, and a carefully researched piece connecting Reverend Hathaway to the railroad company through his brother-in-law. She printed 50 copies and began distributing them around town, leaving stacks at the general store, the saloon, and other businesses willing to carry them. The response was immediate and mixed. Some townspeople eagerly grabbed copies, hungry for local news. Others avoided her, eyes darting nervously toward the church as if Reverend Hathaway might appear at any moment. By mid-afternoon, Faith had distributed nearly all her copies and was heading back to her office when a commotion ahead caught her attention. A crowd had gathered outside the church, where Reverend Hathaway stood on the steps, one of her newspapers clutched in his hand, his face contorted with rage, blasphemy, and slander. He was shouting as Faith approached. "This woman seeks to undermine the moral foundation of our community with her lies and insinuations." Faith stopped at the edge of the crowd, heart pounding but chin high. She had expected backlash, but not this public denunciation. "Everything printed in the Herald is factual and verified," she called out, drawing all eyes to her. "If the Reverend disputes specific points, I welcome his corrections." Reverend Hathaway's gaze found her, cold with fury. "You dare question my integrity? You, a woman alone living in sin, spreading discord among decent folk." "I question only your undisclosed business interests," Faith replied steadily. "And I live honestly by my own labor, which is no sin in any scripture I've read." A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Let her speak," while another voice countered, "A woman's got no business with a newspaper." Reverend Hathaway raised his hands for silence. "This woman has brought shame upon our town with her unwomanly behavior, and now with these slanderous publications. I call upon the good citizens of Promise Creek to show her that she is not welcome here until she repents and assumes a proper woman's role." Faith felt a chill at his words. They bordered dangerously close to incitement. Before she could respond, a figure pushed through the crowd to stand beside her. Sam Garrett, dust covered from riding, his expression hard as he surveyed the scene. "Seems to me," he said, voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering, "that a preacher calling for persecution isn't following his own gospel very well." Reverend Hathaway's face darkened. "Mr. Garrett, I'm not surprised to find you defending her, birds of a feather, as they say." "If by that you mean people who value truth, then yes," Sam replied evenly. "Miss O'Malley's newspaper presents facts, facts that some might find uncomfortable, but facts nonetheless." "She accuses me of corruption," Hathaway snapped. "She reports your business connections," Sam corrected. "Connections you've kept hidden while preaching against the very people working for companies you profit from." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Faith could sense opinion dividing. some nodding in agreement with Sam, others glaring at her with increased hostility. "This woman," Reverend Hathaway declared, pointing a finger at Faith, "is a shame to this town and to all decent women who know their proper place." Sam stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Faith. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the hushed crowd. "She's the only blessing this town has seen in a long time. Someone with the courage to speak truth regardless of who it offends." The silence that followed was electric. Faith felt tears pricking at her eyes, moved beyond words by Sam's unwavering support. Sheriff Mills pushed through the crowd, looking uncomfortable. "That's enough now. No laws being broken here, just words. Everyone go on about your business." Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. Reverend Hathaway retreated into the church, but not before fixing Faith with a look that promised this wasn't over. As the last onlookers drifted away, Faith turned to Sam. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, his blue eyes intense. "Hathaway's dangerous when his authority is challenged, and I meant every word." Faith swallowed hard. "Thank you, but I'm afraid I've made you a target as well now." Sam shrugged, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Wouldn't be the first time I've stood on the unpopular side of things." "Come on, let's get you back to the ranch. Not safe for you to stay in town tonight." As they walked toward where Sam had left his horse, Faith sensed they'd crossed some invisible threshold. The conflict with Reverend Hathaway had escalated beyond mere disapproval into something more sinister. And in standing with her, Sam had declared himself unmistakably as her ally, perhaps as something more. Faith spent the evening at the Barlow Ranch, sharing dinner with the Hands and recounting the confrontation in town. Mr. Barlow read her newspaper with interest, nodding approval at her thorough reporting. "Been waiting years for someone to expose Hathaway's railroad connections," he commented. "Man preaches charity on Sundays while profiting from near-slave labor on Mondays." After dinner, Faith retreated to her small room, intending to plan the next edition of the Herald. But her mind kept returning to Sam, his steady presence beside her in town, the conviction in his voice when he'd called her a blessing. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Sam standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. "Mind if I come in?" Faith stepped aside to let him enter. The small room suddenly seemed much smaller with his tall frame filling it. They sat across from each other at the little table, steam rising from their cups in the lamplight. "Are you all right?" Sam asked after a moment. "Today couldn't have been easy." Faith wrapped her hands around her cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "I knew there would be opposition, though I admit I didn't expect quite such a public denouncement. Hathaway feels threatened." "You exposed what he's worked years to keep hidden. What will he do next?" Faith asked quietly. Sam's expression turned grave. "Hard to say. Men like him don't take kindly to losing face. You should be careful." "I won't stop publishing," Faith said firmly. "Didn't expect you would." Sam's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Wouldn't respect you as much if you did." Faith looked up at him, struck by his words. "You respect me more than anyone I've met in a long time," he replied, his voice low and earnest. "Takes rare courage to stand alone for what's right." "I'm not alone anymore, though, am I?" Faith said softly. "You stood with me today." Sam's eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. "And I'll keep standing with you, Faith, as long as you'll let me." The sincerity in his voice made her heart beat faster. For a moment neither spoke, the silence between them charged with possibility. "Why?" Faith finally asked. "Why risk your position, your reputation for me?" Sam set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. When I first came to town, I saw a woman standing alone against a tide of disapproval, fighting for something she believed in. Reminded me of why I joined the cavalry years ago to protect those ideals of freedom and truth. He paused, his eyes finding hers again. But it's more than that now. I've come to care for you, Faith, more than I expected to, more than might be wise given the circumstances. Faith felt warmth bloom in her chest at his confession. I've come to care for you too, Sam, though as you say, the timing is complicated. Sam reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. Life out here is always complicated. Doesn't mean we shouldn't reach for what matters. Faith turned her hand over, letting her fingers lace with his. This quiet moment of connection felt more intimate than any touch she'd ever known. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Sam said, squeezing her hand gently, "we face whatever comes next, together." The quiet promise in those words settled over Faith like a blanket, offering comfort against the uncertain days ahead. The next morning, Faith rode into town with Sam, determined to continue her work despite Reverend Hathaway's opposition. As they approached her office, however, Faith's heart sank. The windows had been smashed, glass littering the boardwalk, and across the door, someone had painted the word "sinner" in red letters. Sam dismounted quickly, helping Faith down from her horse before examining the damage. "Stay here," he instructed, drawing his revolver before cautiously pushing open the door. Faith waited, heart pounding, until Sam emerged a few minutes later, his expression grim. "They destroyed your printing press," he said quietly. "Smashed it to pieces." Faith pushed past him into the office, needing to see for herself. Inside, destruction greeted her, papers scattered, furniture overturned, and in the center of the room, her precious printing press lay in ruins, its metal components twisted and broken beyond repair. Months of savings, of sacrifice, reduced to worthless scrap. She stood frozen, staring at the devastation until she felt Sam's hand on her shoulder. "Faith," he said gently, "I'm sorry." Something broke inside her then, not her determination, but the dam holding back her emotions. Tears filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks as she turned and pressed her face against Sam's chest. His arms came around her immediately, strong and secure, holding her as she wept for all she had lost. "Who would do this?" she finally asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Could be anyone Hathaway incited," Sam replied, his hand moving soothingly across her back. "We'll report it to Sheriff Mills, though I doubt he'll do much." Faith pulled back slightly, wiping at her tears. "Without my press, I can't publish. That's what they wanted." "We'll figure something out," Sam promised. "This isn't the end, Faith." She looked around at the destruction again, drawing strength from Sam's presence beside her. "No," she agreed, her voice steadying. "It's not the end. Help me gather what can be salvaged." They worked together, collecting undamaged papers and supplies, straightening what furniture remained intact. Sheriff Mills came by, took a cursory look around, and made vague promises about investigating that neither Faith nor Sam believed. As they were finishing, Mr. Barlow arrived, having heard about the vandalism from a ranch hand who'd been in town. "This is unacceptable," the rancher declared, surveying the damage. "Destroying a woman's livelihood because you disagree with her words, that's not the West I believe in." "Without my press, I can't continue the Herald," Faith said, the reality of her situation sinking in deeper. Mr. Barlow stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Maybe not the Herald as it was, but there's an old letterpress at the ranch belonged to my wife when she taught school. It's small, but it works, and I've got a wagon heading to Cheyenne next week, could send for proper press parts." Hope flickered in Faith's chest. "You do that. Consider it an investment," Barlow replied with a wink. "First newspaper to tell the truth around here deserves support." As they loaded Faith's salvaged belongings onto Barlow's wagon, a crowd began to gather in the street. Word of the vandalism had spread quickly. Some faces showed sympathy, others satisfaction, but most simply watched with the wary curiosity of people wondering which way the wind would blow. Reverend Hathaway appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression solemn but his eyes alight with triumph as he surveyed the damaged office. "Perhaps," he called out, loud enough for all to hear, "this is divine guidance, Miss O'Malley, a sign that your path here was mistaken." Before Faith could respond, another voice rang out from the crowd. "Or perhaps it's a sign of how far some men will go to hide the truth." Faith turned to see Mrs. Anderson from the general store pushing forward, her normally timid demeanor replaced by righteous indignation. "I've lived in Promise Creek for 30 years, Mrs. Anderson continued, addressing the crowd rather than the preacher. "I've seen good times and bad, honest folk and criminals, but I've never seen anything as shameful as destroying a woman's livelihood because she printed facts you don't like." Murmurs of agreement rose from parts of the crowd. Emboldened, Tommy from the Barlow Ranch stepped forward. "Miss O'Malley's paper told us things we needed to know. About the railroad cheating workers, about the water rights upstream. She's an unmarried woman living alone, spreading discord." Reverend Hathaway countered. "The Bible teaches that women should be modest and submissive. The Bible also teaches thou shalt not steal," came Sam's steady voice as he moved to stand beside Faith. "Yet someone stole Miss O'Malley's right to earn her living last night." "Was that your teaching, Reverend?" The crowd had grown larger now, and Faith could sense the tide of opinion shifting. Not everyone supported her, but many were troubled by the violence against her property. "I did not condone destruction," Reverend Hathaway insisted, though his eyes shifted away from the direct accusation. "But you called her a shame to this town," Sam pressed. "You told people she wasn't welcome here. What did you expect would happen?" The preacher's face flushed. "I will not be questioned by a drifter and a careful Reverend," Mr. Barlow interrupted, his voice cold. "Choose your next words with care." A tense silence fell over the gathered townspeople. Faith looked around at the faces, some hostile, some supportive, many uncertain. Whatever happened next would determine whether she had a future in Promise Creek. Drawing a deep breath, Faith stepped forward to address the crowd. "I came to Promise Creek because I believe in the power of truth," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "I believe that people deserve to know what affects their lives, their livelihoods, their futures. That's all the Herald aimed to provide: facts, not rumors, truth, not manipulation." She gestured to her damaged office. "Someone tried to silence that truth last night, but I won't be silenced. With Mr. Barlow's help, the Herald will continue. It may be smaller for a time, printed on a letterpress instead of a proper printing press, but it will continue." Faith turned to face Reverend Hathaway directly. "You've called me a shame to this town, Reverend. But the true shame lies in using fear and intimidation to control what people know and think. That's not faith, it's tyranny." A long moment of silence followed her words. Then, slowly, Mrs. Anderson began to clap. Tommy joined her, then other ranch hands, then several townspeople. Not everyone, some turned away, scowling, and Reverend Hathaway himself stormed off toward the church, but enough that Faith felt a surge of hope. As the crowd began to disperse, Sam moved to her side, his eyes filled with admiration. "That," he said quietly, "was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Faith managed a smile, exhaustion and emotion catching up with her. "I'm not sure where I found the words." "They were in you all along," Sam replied, "just like that spirit that wouldn't let you give up." Mr. Barlow approached them, nodding his approval. "Well said, Miss O'Malley." Now let's get you back to the ranch before anything else happens. Tomorrow's soon enough to start rebuilding." As they drove away from town, Faith's damaged office growing smaller behind them, she felt Sam's hand cover hers on the wagon seat. A simple touch, but in it was a promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The letterpress Mr. Barlow provided was indeed small, designed for printing school lessons rather than newspapers, but it worked. Over the next 2 weeks, Faith established a makeshift office in a corner of the Barlow Ranch storehouse, publishing a reduced version of the Herald every 3 days. Word spread beyond Promise Creek. Faith began receiving letters from readers in neighboring settlements, sharing stories that needed telling: a corrupt mining company shorting workers' pay, a land office clerk taking bribes to process certain claims first. With each edition, the Herald's reputation for honest reporting grew, as did its subscriber list. Reverend Hathaway maintained his public opposition, delivering sermons about women's proper roles and the dangers of secular influences. But with Faith now operating from the safety of the Barlow Ranch, and with growing community support for her work, his power to intimidate had diminished. Sam remained a constant presence in Faith's life, helping with the physical labor of printing, riding to neighboring settlements to distribute papers, and standing beside her whenever she ventured into town. Their bond deepened with each passing day, private moments stolen between work conversations under starlit skies, shared meals, the occasional brush of hands that lingered longer than necessary. One evening, as Faith finished setting type for the next day's edition, Sam appeared in the doorway of the storehouse, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Special delivery," he said with a smile, setting it on her makeshift desk. "Came on today's stage from Cheyenne." Faith unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, the words Promise Creek Herald embossed in gold on the cover. "Sam," she breathed, running her fingers over the fine craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. Thought you could use something special for planning future editions," he explained. "Something worthy of the work you're doing." Faith looked up at him, emotion tightening her throat. In that moment, with the golden light of sunset streaming through the windows and catching in his hair, she saw clearly what had been growing between them, something deeper and more precious than mere alliance or friendship. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, but for everything. I couldn't have continued without you." Sam moved closer, perching on the edge of her desk. "Yes, you could have," he countered gently. "You're the strongest person I know, Faith O'Malley. You'd have found a way." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." Their eyes held, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Sam reached out slowly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light against her skin. "Faith," he said, his voice lower, "there's something I need to tell you." Her heart quickened. "Yes." "Barlow's sending me to Cheyenne next week. The new printing press you ordered is ready, but it needs someone who knows how to transport it safely. I'll be gone at least 10 days. Disappointment washed through her, though she tried not to show it. "Oh, that's good news about the press." Sam's hand moved to cover hers. "I don't want to go," he admitted. "Not now, not when things are." He hesitated, searching for words. "Changing between us," Faith supplied quietly. He nodded, relief in his eyes that she understood. "Yes. But Barlow needs someone he trusts, and the press is important for the Herald's future." "Then you should go," Faith said, turning her hand to lace her fingers with his. "I'll be here when you return." Sam's gaze dropped to their joined hands, then back to her face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward. Faith's eyes fluttered closed as his lips met hers, a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as she responded. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Sam rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. Faith smiled, her heart fuller than she'd ever known it could be. "I've been hoping you would." The 10 days of Sam's absence were the longest of Faith's life. She threw herself into her work, publishing 3 editions of the Herald and expanding its distribution to include a settlement 30 miles north. The community's response continued to grow more positive, with new subscribers signing up daily, and even a few of the businesses that had withdrawn their advertising cautiously returning. Reverend Hathaway remained conspicuously silent during this period, which worried Faith more than his open opposition had. She mentioned her concerns to Mr. Barlow one evening as they shared coffee on the ranch house porch. "Man like Hathaway doesn't just surrender," the rancher agreed, puffing on his pipe. "He's planning something." "But what?" Faith wondered. "The Herald is gaining support. Even some of his congregation are subscribing now." "That's likely what's got him cornered," Barlow mused. Nothing more dangerous than a man who feels his influence slipping. On the 11th day after Sam's departure, Faith was working in her makeshift office when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up expectantly, hoping to see Sam returning with her new press, she instead found Sheriff Mills dismounting outside, his expression grim. "Miss O'Malley," he called, removing his hat as she stepped outside. "Need a word." "What is it, Sheriff?" Faith asked, a sense of foreboding settling over her. "Got a wire from the marshal in Cheyenne," Mills said, shifting uncomfortably. "There was trouble. Garrett was attacked while overseeing the loading of your printing press. He's alive but hurt bad. They've got him at the doctor's in Cheyenne." Faith felt the blood drain from her face. Attacked? By whom? Wire didn't say. Just that he was jumped by 3 men, beaten something fierce. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Marshall thought you should know, given that Garrett was there on your business." "I need to go to him," Faith said immediately, her mind racing. "When does the next stage leave for Cheyenne?" "Not until tomorrow morning," Mills replied. "But Miss O'Malley, it's not proper for a lady to—" "Proper," Faith interrupted, anger flaring through her fear. "A man who stood up for me, for truth, is lying injured, possibly dying, and you're concerned with propriety." The sheriff had the grace to look abashed. "Just saying it's a rough journey and Cheyenne's a rough town." "I'll go with her," came Mr. Barlow's voice as he approached from the main house. "Was heading to Cheyenne myself next week anyway. We'll take my wagon at first light faster than waiting for the stage." Mills nodded, clearly relieved to be absolved of responsibility. "Very well. I'll let the marshal know to expect you." After the sheriff departed, Faith turned to Barlow, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you." The rancher waved away her thanks. "Garrett's one of my best men, and he's right about you. You're the blessing this territory needs, whether it knows it or not." Faith spent a sleepless night preparing for the journey, her mind filled with terrible images of Sam lying injured, perhaps calling for her. By the time she and Mr. Barlow set out the next morning, she was exhausted but determined, a small bag of necessities at her feet and fear a constant companion in her heart. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days, over rough trails that tested both their endurance. Faith barely noticed the discomfort, her thoughts focused entirely on reaching Sam. When they finally arrived, the territorial capital seemed impossibly large and chaotic after Promise Creek, a sprawling town of wooden buildings, boardwalks crowded with people, and the constant clatter of wagons and horses. The doctor's office was near the center of town, a 2-story building with a shingle advertising Dr. Howard Ellis, physician and surgeon. Faith practically ran from the wagon to the door, heart pounding with fear of what she might find inside. A middle-aged woman in a crisp apron met her in the small waiting room. "May I help you? I'm here to see Samuel Garrett," Faith said, her voice tight with anxiety. "He was brought in several days ago after being attacked." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Are you family?" Faith hesitated, unsure how to define what she and Sam were to each other. "I'm Faith O'Malley. He was in Cheyenne on my behalf when he was attacked." Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. "The newspaper woman. He's mentioned you. Often, in fact, when the fevers had him talking." "Fever?" Faith's fear intensified. "How badly is he hurt?" "3 broken ribs, a broken arm, various cuts and bruises, and a nasty head wound that had us worried." The woman, presumably the doctor's wife or nurse, explained. "The fever broke yesterday, though, which is a good sign." "Doctor says he's past the worst of it. May I see him, please?" Faith asked, unable to keep the pleading note from her voice. Mrs. Ellis studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me, but just for a little while he needs rest." She led Faith upstairs to a small, clean room where Sam lay on a narrow bed, his face bruised, his right arm splinted and bandaged, his torso wrapped in white strips of cloth. Despite the injuries, the steady rise and fall of his chest brought tears of relief to Faith's eyes. "Sam," she whispered, moving to his bedside and carefully taking his uninjured hand. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing blue eyes clouded with pain but brightening as they focused on her face. "Faith," his voice was hoarse, disbelieving. "You're really here?" "I'm here," she confirmed, squeezing his hand gently. "Mr. Barlow brought me as soon as we got word you were hurt." Sam closed his eyes briefly, a pained smile touching his lips. "Didn't want you to see me like this." "Don't be ridiculous," Faith chided softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Who did this to you, Sam?" His expression darkened. "Don't know their names. 3 men caught me leaving the freight office after arranging transport for your press. Said they had a message that women who don't know their place should be taught lessons, and so should the men who support them." Faith's blood ran cold, recognizing the echo of the threatening note she'd received weeks ago. "Hathaway," she breathed. "Can't prove it," Sam cautioned. "They didn't say who sent them, but yeah, that would be my guess." Faith felt rage building inside her. That Reverend Hathaway would go this far would hurt Sam to get to her. The emotion must have shown on her face because Sam squeezed her hand. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't let anger consume you. That's what he wants." "He hurt you because of me," Faith said, voice breaking. "How can I not be angry?" "Be angry," Sam allowed. "But don't let it change you. Don't let it make you afraid to keep doing what's right." Faith looked down at their joined hands, drawing strength from his touch despite his weakened state. "The doctor's wife said you've been talking about me, in your fever." A faint flush colored Sam's bruised cheeks. "Did she now? What did you say?" Faith asked, a small smile finding its way through her worry. Sam's eyes held hers, all pretense gone. "Probably that I love you, because I do, Faith O'Malley. Have since I watched you stand up to Hathaway that first day in the general store." The words stole Faith's breath. She'd known, somehow, that what had grown between them was love, but hearing it spoken aloud, especially now, with Sam injured because of his connection to her, made it both more real and more frightening. "You don't have to say anything back," Sam added quickly. "I know it's fast and complicated, and I love you too," Faith interrupted, the words falling from her lips with absolute certainty. "And it terrifies me, because look what loving me has cost you already." Sam's hand moved to her cheek, his touch gentle despite his injuries. "Worth it," he said simply. "You're worth any price, Faith. Don't you know that by now?" Mrs. Ellis appeared in the doorway, clearing her throat. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Garrett needs his rest now." Faith nodded, reluctantly preparing to leave. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised Sam. "Mr. Barlow has business in town for a few days." "The press," Sam remembered suddenly. "It's at the freight office, paid for and ready to ship. Was supposed to go out on tomorrow's wagon train to Promise Creek." "Don't worry about the press now," Faith said. "Just focus on getting better." As she rose to leave, Sam caught her hand once more. "Faith, be careful in town if Hathaway's men are still here." "I will," she assured him. "Rest now." Faith returned to the doctor's office every day for the next week, watching with relief as Sam's condition steadily improved. Between visits, she arranged for the shipping of her new printing press and explored Cheyenne, gathering stories and information for future editions of the Herald. On her 6th day in town, as Faith was returning to the hotel where she and Mr. Barlow were staying, she noticed a man following her, a rough-looking character she'd seen watching the doctor's office earlier. Quickening her pace, Faith ducked into a busy general store, weaving through the crowded aisles until she reached the back exit. She slipped out into the alley behind, heart pounding, and made her way to the hotel by a circuitous route. That evening she confided her fears to Mr. Barlow over dinner. "Could be nothing," the rancher said, though his expression was concerned, "but could be Hathaway's not done trying to scare you off." "Sam's almost well enough to travel," Faith replied. "The doctor says another 3 days and he can leave, though he'll need to take it easy for weeks." Barlow nodded thoughtfully. "My business here's nearly concluded. We could head back to Promise Creek day after tomorrow, all 3 of us." "What about my press?" Faith asked. "Already arranged for it to follow on next week's freight wagon," Barlow assured her. "Better to get you and Garrett back safely than worry about a piece of equipment, however valuable." The next morning, as Faith was preparing to visit Sam, a knock came at her hotel room door. Expecting Mr. Barlow, she opened it to find the territorial marshal standing in the hallway, his expression grave. "Miss O'Malley, Marshal James Bennett, might I have a word?" Faith invited him in, anxiety building as she noted his serious demeanor. "We've arrested 3 men for the attack on Mr. Garrett," the marshal informed her without preamble. "They were trying to leave town, but one of my deputies recognized them from descriptions given by witnesses." Relief washed through Faith. "That's wonderful news, Marshal." "Have they said who hired them?" Bennett's face darkened. "That's where it gets interesting. They claim they were paid by a man named Hathaway, a preacher from Promise Creek. Despite having suspected as much, hearing it confirmed sent a chill through Faith. "Will you arrest him too?" "That's the problem," Bennett sighed. "It's their word against his, and a preacher carries a lot of weight around these parts, unless we get more evidence." Faith's mind raced. What kind of evidence? A paper trail, proof he paid them, witnesses who saw them together? The marshal shrugged. "Without something concrete, it's unlikely charges against Reverend Hathaway would stick." After the marshal left, Faith hurried to the doctor's office to share the news with Sam. She found him sitting up in bed, his color much improved, though the splint on his arm and the bandages around his ribs remained. "They've arrested the men who attacked you," Faith told him, taking her usual seat beside his bed. Sam's expression lightened. "That's good. Did they implicate Hathaway?" "They did, but the marshal says it's not enough for an arrest. They need evidence, proof of payment, witnesses." Faith bit her lip. "Sam, I've been thinking. When we return to Promise Creek, I want to publish what happened. The full story." Sam studied her face. "That could be dangerous, Faith. Hathaway's already shown he's willing to go to extremes." "Which is exactly why people need to know," Faith insisted. "If enough people understand what he's capable of, his influence will crumble." "Or he might try something worse," Sam countered, concern evident in his eyes. "I don't want you taking that risk." Faith reached for his hand. We can't let fear dictate our actions. Isn't that what you told me? We can't stop doing what's right just because it's dangerous. Sam looked at their joined hands, then back to her face. A slow smile spread across his lips. Using my own words against me. That's playing dirty, Miss O'Malley. All's fair in love and journalism, Faith replied with a smile of her own. Love, is it? Sam's voice softened as he tugged her gently closer. I seem to recall saying something about that when I was half delirious with fever. Wasn't sure if you'd take it seriously. Faith leaned forward, careful of his injuries, and brushed her lips against his. I take it very seriously, Samuel Garrett. 2 days later, Dr. Ellis declared Sam fit for travel, though with strict instructions to avoid any strenuous activity for at least 3 more weeks. The return journey to Promise Creek was slow and careful, with frequent stops to ensure Sam's comfort. Despite the circumstances, Faith treasured these days on the trail with Sam and Mr. Barlow, the evenings around the campfire, the starlit conversations, the sense of moving forward together toward whatever awaited them. As they approached Promise Creek, Faith's thoughts turned increasingly to her planned article about Hathaway. She'd been making notes throughout the journey, crafting the piece that would expose the preacher's violent tactics. You're sure about this? Sam asked as they made camp on their final night before reaching town. Mr. Barlow had gone to check on the horses, leaving them alone by the fire. I'm sure, Faith replied, closing her journal. The truth needs telling, whatever the consequences. Sam studied her across the flickering flames, pride evident in his gaze. Then I'm with you, all the way. Faith moved to sit beside him, leaning carefully against his uninjured side. What happens after, Sam? When the article is published, when Hathaway's influence is challenged, what then? For the Herald, it grows, becomes the voice of truth it was always meant to be. Sam's arm came around her shoulders. For us, that depends on what you want, Faith. She looked up at him, seeing her future in his eyes. I want this, us, the Herald. A life built on truth and love, however unconventional it might seem to others. Sam pressed a kiss to her temple. Then that's what we'll have. I was thinking the Barlow Ranch has that small cabin near the creek. Hasn't been used in years, but it's sound. With some work, it could be a home. Close enough to town for your newspaper business, but far enough for peace. A home, Faith repeated, the word filling her with warmth. I'd like that. They returned to Promise Creek the next day to find the town largely unchanged, though Faith noted more curious glances than hostile ones as they drove down the main street. Word of Sam's attack in Cheyenne had spread, creating sympathy among those who'd previously been neutral about Faith and her newspaper. With Mr. Barlow's continued support, Faith established a temporary office at the ranch while awaiting her new press. She wrote her article about Hathaway meticulously, including the marshal's confirmation that the arrested men had implicated the preacher. She also included a broader examination of how Hathaway's business interests conflicted with his public preaching connections she'd been quietly investigating for months. When the new press arrived, Faith published a special edition of the Herald dedicated entirely to the story. Sam insisted on helping distribute it, despite his still healing injuries, saying he wanted to face any backlash by her side. The town's reaction was swift and divided. Some residents refused to accept the accusations against their preacher, but many others were troubled by the detailed evidence Faith presented. A town meeting was called, with Reverend Hathaway forced to address the allegations publicly. Faith and Sam attended, sitting at the back of the crowded town hall as Hathaway took the stage, his face flushed with righteous indignation. These lies, he thundered, holding up Faith's newspaper, are the desperate attempts of an immoral woman to discredit a man of God. I categorically deny any involvement in the regrettable attack on Mr. Garrett. From the audience, Sheriff Mills stood. Reverend, the marshal in Cheyenne wired me the confessions of the men arrested. They gave specific details about payments you made, meetings you had. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Another man rose, Mr. Chen, whose wife Faith had interviewed months ago about railroad working conditions. My cousin works at bank in Cheyenne, he said in accented English. He see Reverend take money out same day men say they get paid, large amount. Hathaway's face paled visibly. That's coincidence. I was withdrawing funds for church repairs. Which church repairs, Reverend? Called out Mrs. Anderson from near the front. Because the committee hasn't approved any new work since the bell tower last year. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that, with more townspeople coming forward with questions and observations that cast doubt on Hathaway's denials. Faith watched it unfold, a complex mix of emotions washing through her vindication, certainly, but also sadness that a man who should have been a moral leader had fallen so far. It's over for him, Sam said quietly beside her. Whether or not he faces legal consequences, he's lost his moral authority here. Faith nodded, leaning slightly against Sam's good shoulder. Truth has a way of finding the light, doesn't it? 3 weeks later, Reverend Hathaway left Promise Creek quietly in the night, leaving behind a note of resignation for the church committee. The territorial marshal had insufficient evidence to charge him with ordering the attack on Sam, but the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict. The church hired a younger preacher from Denver, a man who preached compassion over judgment, and who, to Faith's surprise, subscribed to the Herald his first week in town. Sam's recovery progressed steadily, and by midsummer, he and Faith had begun renovating the small cabin by the creek on Barlow's property. Faith's newspaper flourished, gaining subscribers throughout the territory and earning a reputation for honest, fearless reporting. On a golden evening in late August, as they sat on the porch of their nearly completed cabin, Sam took Faith's hand. "Been carrying something around for a few weeks now," he said, reaching into his pocket with his still slightly stiff right hand. "Waiting for the right moment." He withdrew a small gold ring with a simple pearl setting. Faith's breath caught as he held it between them, the last rays of sunset catching its surface. "I'm not a wealthy man," Sam said softly. "Can't offer you a grand house or fine things. But I can promise to stand beside you always, to support your work and your dreams, to love you faithfully for all my days." He met her eyes, his own filled with emotion. "Faith O'Malley, will you marry me?" Faith looked at the man before her, this strong, principled, gentle man who had defended her when she stood alone, who had nearly died for supporting her cause, who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy filling her eyes. "Yes, Samuel Garrett, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her gently into his arms, his kiss a promise of the life they would build together. 2 months later, they were married in a simple ceremony at the Barlow Ranch, surrounded by friends who had stood by them through the darkest days. Mrs. Anderson dabbed tears from her eyes as Faith and Sam exchanged vows, while Tommy and the other ranch hands cheered enthusiastically when they were pronounced husband and wife. The new preacher, Reverend Collins, who had performed the ceremony, offered a blessing that seemed especially fitting. "May your union be built on truth and love, and may you continue to be a blessing to all whose lives you touch." As the celebration continued around them, Sam led Faith away for a moment of privacy by the creek that would run beside their home. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Faith replied, looking up at the man who had first defended her dignity in a general store what seemed a lifetime ago. "When I came west, I was searching for my voice, for the freedom to tell important stories. I never expected to find a love story of my own." Sam smiled, touching his forehead to hers. "And quite a story it is. The preacher called you a shame to the town, until a cowboy said I was the only blessing he needed," Faith finished, her heart full to bursting with love and gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. As the sun set on Promise Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Faith knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else together, with truth and love as their guiding stars. 5 years later, Faith stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Sam taught their 3-year-old daughter Rose to ride her first pony in the fenced yard. Inside, their 6-month-old son James slept peacefully in his cradle, while the offices of the Promise Creek Herald, now the most respected newspaper in the territory, bustled with activity in the purpose-built addition to their home. The town had grown and prospered, becoming known for its progressive attitudes and fair business practices. Faith's editorials were quoted in papers as far away as Denver and San Francisco, and she had mentored several young women who dreamed of following in her path. As Rose's delighted laughter rang out across the yard, Faith touched the golden locket at her throat, Sam's gift on the birth of their daughter. Inside was a tiny slip of paper bearing the words that had changed everything. "She's the only blessing I need." In those words, Faith had found not just love, but the courage to create the life she'd always dreamed of, a life of purpose, truth, and profound happiness, shared with the man who had seen her value when others saw only shame. And that, Faith knew, was the greatest blessing of all.